Hello, my name is Nick Caploni. I'm Artquest Senior Programme Coordinator, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Calum Perrin, recipient of the 2021 Unlocking the Collections Residency with the Museum of the Home. This research residency is a new partnership between Artquest and the Museum of the Home, who are funding the award. It provides an artist with a £3,000 award and privileged access to the materials in the museum's collection library. The selected artist will explore the collection with support from the museum's curators at a pivotal point in the organisation's development and its reopening to the public. This is the first in the series of 3 interviews that will chart the selected artist's experience in working with the collection. So Calum, thanks very much for joining me today for this.
No worries.
I just wondered if we could kick off, if you could just say a little bit about where your practice was just before you sort of started the sort of residency.
Yeah, so my practice is originally rooted in sound, although I don't really see myself as a sound artist. That has particular connotations, I think. So my practice was very much based around kind of like sound and sort of using elements of like musical composition and also documentary research, especially in terms of making things for radio. So I suppose experimental audio documentary, working on stuff for like shortcuts on Radio 4, Between the Ears on Radio 3, which I suppose is that kind of sort of producer-led kind of radio or sonic experimentation. And I also have a background in performance, sort of experimental performance and improvisation as well, kind of collaborative, sort of multidisciplinary work where I'm often doing kind of improvised sounds, and especially it's sort of using field recordings within live settings, and then also printmaking as well, as a way of kind of like sort of physicalizing some of this some of this kind of material, and my sort of fascination with the tactile, and the way that specifically the way that the tactile links to autistic experience and disability more generally. I mean, that's all kind of very, very wide, but that's kind of quite
No, that's a great introduction, and it's it's interesting to hear how your practice sort of crosses and connects with like a number of other kind of areas like sort of radio and stuff as well, and sort of performance. I just wondered if you could say a little bit about very practically speaking, like how you sort of support your practice.
Yeah, so I am a sound designer as well. So I do sound design for an LGBT podcast on BBC Sounds, and I do one-off kind of sort of radio sound design gigs as well, which I don't necessarily see that work as like separate to my practice. I see it as sort of part of it, and it's a kind of a spectrum from facilitation to sort of just sort of creation for its own sake. But it's very, very useful in terms of making sure I'm constantly like sort of practicing my craft, really.
Yeah.
And always sort of considering, especially, yeah, it's like that link, especially when doing sound design stuff. It's that link between it's the link between sort of like the abstraction of sound and then content, and how sort of sound and documentary content can kind of work together. So I do that, and sometimes I do, very occasionally, do sort of sound engineering for folk music specifically.
Oh wow, cool!
Something really? I kind of like fell into.
Is that a musical genre that you're into yourself, or?
I've become interested in it through doing this work, I think. But no, I am, because class is such an important sort of part of my worldview and my work and stuff like that, and because folk music is working class music, especially like when you get down into like the real like not commercial stuff, like kind of real sort of like folk
Yeah.
music in the world being made. Yeah, that work being made by like, yeah, like, you know, contemporary folk practitioners and stuff, and also it has this interesting crossover with experimental music, improvised musics, and things like that. So yeah, that's like really, to be honest, that I don't really make much money from doing that. That's something that I do kind of for fun more than anything, and it's a bonus. I very much like that. But yeah, like a lot of my work, I you know, it's because I do so much stuff. It's kind of like it's picking up bits and pieces from here and there within this kind of like sort of audio arts world, I suppose. Because yeah, I do like sort of theatre sound design as well. I've just done and sometimes that crosses over. I'm doing sound design for a play, an audio play for Audible at the minute. But then also like I work in theatre and like creative role. I just did an R&D with the Yard. The Yard Theatre in Hackney Wick, and then kind of continuing that, applying for kind of Arts Council funding for that work as well. And then when it comes to stuff like shortcuts or between the ears, which are like the probably the best outlet for interesting and challenging audio work in the kind of mainstream in the UK. That's when I see things as really kind of like, oh, this is really about my purely my kind of creative practice.
Yeah.
And I'm not doing this for anyone else.
Yeah.
And then it's about continuing to find, I think there's less opportunities for the kind of the sort of the in terms of so yeah, that then supports, I suppose, my broader sort of like work, which is more within the sort of visual arts sphere.
Sure.
Although I'm doing a project, a collaboration with artist Sian Hutchinson with the Bodleian Library for their Sensational Books exhibition, where we're kind of making kind of a book sort of thing. Yeah, we're making a kind of artist books thing that deals with the physicality of books, basically. So yeah, there's all these different things. But yeah, sorry, that's really long-winded.
No, but I mean, I think it needs to be, doesn't it? Because as quite frequently is the case, like the way that sort of people support their practice is actually from a kind of range of different sources, with like an overlapping relationship with the sort of practice as individuals as well. So it's really interesting to hear about all of that. I mean, it is kind of quite complicated to know. I think for some practitioners, you know, obviously like a lot of artists teach. So like there's this kind of clear sort of distinction that even like obviously when artists teach, that often forms part of the overall practice, but there's a clear distinction between I'm a practicing artist and then I like teach as well. Like or a lot of artists will have like a completely unrelated day job. I think in terms of what I do, it kind of gets quite confusing. So when you're kind of in terms of sort of focusing your creative energies and things like that, there's a kind of like a question of like really having to be disciplined and often failing to be disciplined in terms of finding space for your practice amongst all of these things that, as I say, have that spectrum from facilitation to creative practice. Yeah. But I mean, I guess the flip side to that is that because there's sort of creative energy to be got from them all, because they're sort of quite close to the core of what your sort of practice is about.
Exactly, and being influenced by like it's collaborations like so important to me. So like if I'm working with other artists or people who are creative in different ways, whether that's like a radio producer who has like a really defined idea for this, what they're creating, and I'm doing sound design for them or something like that, that's kind of infectious and that's inspiring as well.
Yeah. I mean, so it sounds like most of that work is on a, I guess, freelance basis.
Yes, 100%.
So I just had a question about the pandemic really, and how that impacted on your work, and particularly your work as an artist and in those areas that we've been sort of talking about. And did you have to make any kind of particular changes in how you worked as a result of the whole, COVID lockdowns?
I think that it's a little bit conflicting for me, because I think I think I benefited a lot from the first round of like emergency Arts Council funding.
Yeah,
quite a lot of opportunities went up, and because I was interested in making work sort of about how the pandemic was affecting disabled people, that was of interest to a lot of kind of institutions as well.
Right.
So I kind of got, along with my friend Ashlyn Gallagher, who was also autistic, and we were kind of making some work together at that point. I got or together we got a few small a few kind of small opportunities to make work, and that kind of really got the ball rolling for me, kind of like after the initial dip with the pandemic, and then that allowed me to gain a lot more experience.
Yeah.
And a lot more, I suppose, a lot more sort of like insight into working with kind of like different sort of like arts groups and things, and how to deal with those collaborations. And like as soon as I kind of like had that knowledge, I felt a lot more confident about like applying for different opportunities like that.
Yeah.
And then that sort of boosting confidence then made me a lot more confident with my own work.
Yeah.
And allowed me to sort of like allowed me to experiment a little bit more with my work, kind of like move past it. Obviously I work in all these kind of different areas, and it allowed me to maybe feel a bit less sort of like embarrassed about that. That can sometimes feel a bit embarrassing, because I haven't been to art school. I'm not like a kind of like a trained sort of artist like that. But when essentially my kind of the thrust of my work is kind of conceptual,
yeah,
it then becomes a little bit if you don't have a clear sort of medium, it becomes a little bit embarrassing. But I think through this boosting confidence that I got from actually like practically having the context to make work, I sort of embraced that a little bit, and that actually allowed my identity as an artist to develop.
Yeah.
I think before COVID, I had very kind of like limited confidence, and I didn't really know what I was kind of practicing for, I suppose. And so that was that was kind of like, so even though like initially with COVID, it was worrying in terms of the arts and things like that. I think that the sort of response and the desire from kind of like I work with like Sydenham Arts in London, Film Pro, and HARP, it was like a kind of Arts Council Wales sort of project and stuff like that. And there was so much desire to kind of use art to document elements of the pandemic that specifically in terms of the work and subject matter that I look at in my work, it was very, very useful. I realized that's just not the case at all for a lot of artists.
Yeah.
And also like, it wasn't like I had lots and lots of projects that then suddenly kind of fell away because of the pandemic. So I was just at the right point in my career that it didn't kind of like, it didn't affect me that much. And also I had the benefit that because before this I was working in like care work and stuff. So then that wasn't affected by the pandemic starting.
Yeah.
So that wasn't kind of like that wasn't like a worry. There wasn't some like huge worry about kind of practically working and
sure
and stuff. So like it was quite an interesting kind of it was a kind of quite an interesting process for me that. But obviously like there's a sense of like guilt about that.
Honestly,
do you know what I mean?
There is, but I mean, do you know what? It's so nice and good to hear that actually something that for some artists, it acted as a sort of like a focus, or actually the sort of circumstances then sort of fit to their particular like approaches and their ways of working. So, you know, it's really good to have good news, and these things are like very double-edged swords, aren't they? Because when there's sort of a massive upheaval and a big change to our kind of working environments and like the sort of ecology that we work in, actually it's really important to kind of sort of reflect on the cases and the practices that we're able to sort of thrive given the sort of circumstances.
Exactly.
So,
and I don't think it can be separated from my experience as like an autistic person, and like how actually the initial lockdown kind of gave me just so much quiet and so much sort of like space, like just on a sensory level.
Yeah.
And that was kind of massively useful for me. You know, even though elements of it were really, really hard, like it was, I know, you know, a number of other autistic people who've said the same thing, that the conditions of the lockdown were actually kind of quite good for like sensory control.
Yeah.
And being able to kind of like regulate some of the things that might make me overwhelmed on a day-to-day basis.
But also just in terms of like you know, the pace that we were all sort of living at and operating at, having to like, yeah, just stop and think again about that and just sort of reset has got, yeah, there's difficulties and benefits sort of associated with that. But you know, that's really interesting to hear that. And in relation to sort of this residency, so do you feel like the work that you did immediately after the pandemic kind of sort of helped in terms of focusing what you were thinking about for this residency as well?
Definitely. It's kind of funny, because the pandemic meant that I really, obviously, and a lot of people really honed in on the domestic, because we were kind of confronted with home, right? And home became something inescapable. But at the same time, it was kind of, it almost sort of put me off making work about the sort of domestic space a little bit, because I'd just been interested in that for like so many years, and kind of making work and kind of thinking around that for a long time. And then it suddenly felt like, oh, everyone's making work about this. But I think there was a point where a lot of people were making work about that, but I think that moment has kind of passed as well. So it did allow me to sort of think, like, what am I actually interested in about this? What am I actually interested in about the domestic space and about my experience of the domestic space? It allowed me to sort of like look at that more deeply, and like, what am I really, you know, like, what am I really getting at, and why has this like fascinated me for so long? And so then when it came to making when it came to getting the commission from Film Pro last year, and then making work which was specifically about the like tactile textures of my personal domestic space, that was like a little bit of a breakthrough. Because it wasn't about like, oh, what we all go into the kitchen and put the kettle on or whatever, you know, and it wasn't I think it's important for me not to be making work that's sentimental, and not for me sentimentalizing home, because that's like because that's so easy to do. You know what I mean? It doesn't really like what kind of, what's the, for me it's a bit like, what's the point? I'm interested in home in a different way. And so being able to sort of like make that link between the tactile and the sensory, and then kind of like, then that leading me onto the body, was like this kind of like sort of big breakthrough that that sort of gave me the sort of that put me in a place where this residency was just going to be like so useful for me.
And had you sort of done specifically like a research residency before, or was this the first time that you'd kind of like undertaken a research residency specifically?
Oh yeah, this is the first time I've undertaken a research residency. Yeah, definitely.
But like, what was it about the, can you say a little bit about what it was beyond just this sort of domestic thing about the Museum of the Home specifically that appealed to you as like as a research source?
Well, I think because I was just so aware of the work that Museum of the Home have been doing for the last few years in terms of kind of broadening what they're about and their kind of collections policy, and providing a kind of a museum that had like a thematic focus rather than simply an object-based focus.
Yeah,
I think that was like, that's why it was mega interesting for me. And like, just because I really like the Jeffrey Museum. Like, I've been there multiple times and I really liked it, but it was just never quite there. There was something missing.
Yeah.
And then the work that Museum of the Home has done in the new galleries is exactly what was missing. And you could tell there was always a kind of like an orientation towards that. You could kind of like tell that in the Jeffrey Museum, but it just wasn't, there wasn't space for it to be able to kind of like happen. And there wasn't the sort of the ability for them to sort of like focus on these broader questions of like what the home and what the domestic is beyond the upper middle class. And like now with the new galleries and with the focus on questioning like what home actually is, and these different elements of home. I love the bit in the downstairs galleries about comfort and kind of what comfort is in a home and how that relates to both kind of like objects like different chairs, and then also like how that links to sort of like the more sort of psychological elements of that as well, and the less sort of physical elements, and the photo series they have about like missing, like missing people, and also carers as well. Like these are the things that kind of that broaden. It's not like broaden the definition of home, but kind of like move past the banalities of home. I love the new galleries, and I love the focus that the museum has now. And obviously, I was really aware of their kind of collecting projects during COVID and stuff like that. And I was anticipating the museum reopening for kind of quite a long time. I was quite excited about it. So, and also like I took part in research project that Queen Mary's were doing in collaboration about with Museum of the Home, about artists making work about the domestic and about the home, and I had a really interesting chat with a researcher for that. And I've as I say, like I've been interested in this kind of subject matter for so long, or it's been kind of weaving its way into my work for so long, that it's kind of like a given that I'd be interested in Museum of the Home. Like this was the place that I wanted to sort of engage with, and like it goes. That's why this residency is valuable way beyond my personal research and my artistic practice, because just for my own curiosity, it's so interesting to see kind of inside the museum, and to understand the collections process, and understand the collecting policy and the different projects that they're working on, even though it has nothing to do with my work directly. I just think it's a really fascinating institution.
One of the big challenges for sort of artists applying for research residencies like these is that the call for applications isn't necessarily looking for a fixed outcome, particularly because, as you say, there are all these different opportunities presented by the work and the collections and the people there. So the applications are kind of speculative. And I just wondered if you could give any sort of insight in terms of how you approach the application for this residency, which might help others.
Yeah, I think in some ways, because I'm interested in the whole collection, and I'm interested in everything that the museum has to offer in a way. So it was really hard to kind of think, well, what could an actual sort of project be, and kind of like narrow that down when as you say, there's no particular outcome expected, and also the whole point is that I'm researching and discovering stuff on the way. Like, yeah, that's really difficult. But the way that I see it in terms of applications is, I need to offer the people reading the applications sort of reassurance that I'm going to be able to sort of like think in the right way to develop a research project.
Yeah.
And even if I just have a sort of a vague idea of what I want to do, like the process of developing that within the application then means that if I actually get the residency, then I'll be in a much better place to actually go in, and for me much less overwhelming to sort of go in with some ideas and the sort of sketch of a project in hand. So for me, like when I was originally going in, it was this idea of the sensory aspects of domestic space and articulating those. And then I thought that looking at the collection, the parts of the collection that are listed on the Museum of the Home website, looking at textiles and looking at textile sample books and these arrangements of different sort of surfaces and different sort of like tactile experiences would be really useful. And so that's where I started. So then, like when on the first day that I went in, like Amy Fult's collection manager had got lots of got all these different sample books out. I mean, she did an amazing job. Like she had elements from. She specifically pulled things from every different kind of part of the collection to show sort of like the broadness of what they had that kind of related to this. And so like I looked a lot at that kind of at textiles and it was very interesting. But I think I kind of I discovered that when it comes to actually researching with actual like material and making the most of the material, I've got to sort of be led by that. So I realized that these kind of like the phenomenological sort of stuff that I was talking about is super interesting, but it's not necessarily using the museum in the best way, using the collection in the best way possible if I'm only going to focus on like fabrics or something like that, because I'm not some sort of like historical or sociological researcher coming in and like and being like, okay, this is the type of fabric and this is the manufacturing processes used at this time and this tells us this. No, it's not about that at all. It's a completely different approach. So I then started looking at different elements. I started looking kind of more explicitly at the disability and the stuff in the collection related to disability, which is super limited, and often it's hard to find because things have been catalogued and they haven't explicitly been kind of like sort of tabbed with disability. So me and the support worker Janine, we sat down and we just made like a huge list of like outdated and offensive words for disability, and then like put those into the catalogue and searched on that. And then there's another researcher in she's a PhD student who's on secondment, Museum of the Home. She's called Laura, and she is researching sort of books to do with and cataloguing books at Museum of the Home to do with kind of health and mental health and sex and and exercises in the body and stuff like that. So then sort of she had some sort of recommendations. First it was looking at stuff to do with disability, but then sort of like widened a little bit to do with health. And then we kind of, I went around the rooms that they have set up at Museum of the Home on a Monday when there were no visitors in because the museum was closed. And then so like looking at these kind of combinations of like the furniture sort of like together, and that kind of, again, the sort of experiential element of sort of being within these completely constructed rooms, and then comparing that to all the photos they have and the documenting research kind of. And so like a lot of that time in the first few weeks was spent looking at the everythingness, doing big kind of mind maps, kind of making a lot of notes and stuff like that. And then kind of after and then also kind of looking at more theoretical side, looking at some sort of theories about museums in general and kind of how collections are organized. And so looking a little bit at the sort of the theoretical side as well in my own time, and then coming back to the sort of the material that I've looked at. And then the question that kept returning to was the body, like every time, because I was looking at things that were sort of like missing from the collection, because that's always really interesting. And talking to Amy, the collections manager, like, you know, that was really interesting from her perspective as well. And, you know, in a very literal sense, I found that disability was very much like missing. But I think really what I was getting at in all of this, that the missing element was the body. And, you know, that's something like that can't be acquired and catalogued, right? And so kind of it became clear to me that in order to sort of like collate information which would then help me in terms of my practice, I suppose, or provide a kind of a resource for me to return to for my practice, I needed to kind of like choose some sort of categories, which it was almost like about researching the space around the body. And so kind of if I have a good overview of that, then the kind of the sort of like the space and the spaces in between sort of narrow, then I'm left with the space that of the body. So those kind of categories were disability, which I've done quite a bit on already. The second was sort of imprints, or the sort of like left behind. So looking at sort of worn furniture and appliances and things that had traces of human use.
Yeah.
So there's a great sofa that has kind of worn through on the arms where people have been kind of like sitting on them, and there's a bit on the back of it that's worn where people had maybe brushed past. You know, there's like an old 50s heater with the kind of like marks from where it's been kind of kicked around or like moved with people's feet. There's a post-war utility chair with a mysterious stain on it. and you know, there's all of these things that hint at the way they had been used, and more specifically the way that the body had interacted with them. And then looking at health, the sort of stuff about exercise. There's also home remedies, stuff about maternity and hygiene as well. You know, things about from a healthcare kind of perspective, the relationship between the body and the home. And then the other category was kind of description of the home.
Yeah.
So that was like the first-hand stuff in the Documenting Homes collection. Because again, like when you can get these first-hand experiences of the home, but they don't never describe the interaction between the body and the home. Someone might say, oh, we use this room in this way and tell a story or describe where the furniture is in the room, but it doesn't really say much about the body, the way the body moves through space, the way the room is laid out for the ease of the body, or against the body in some ways when it comes to disabled bodies a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And so those kind of like, you can read between the lines of those descriptions, and then in the Documenting Homes collection, often you have descriptions and then you have photographs of the space. And then sometimes you have like floor plans. And again, when it comes to the furniture, sometimes you have accompanying material that shows maybe photographs of that furniture in situ before it was acquired, or questionnaire about where that furniture was and who owned it, and things like that. That all kind of like, you build up this body of evidence of the relationship between the human. Like, it's because it's not the narrative relationship I'm particularly interested in, it's that sensory tactile relationship. Yeah, so I that's been the kind of, that's the sort of, at this point, at the sort of middle of the process, that's like the focus of my work. And yeah, and then that's gonna, because also I've been researching without having, I haven't been making work over the past couple of weeks. I didn't want to second guess, and I just want to sort of enjoy that like physical process of just going in and looking at things. I definitely don't want to put that pressure on myself to kind of like be like, okay, how can I sort of like respond to this? Again, I have to kind of like build up this framework. For me personally, as a practitioner, I have to build up that framework before I can kind of like unself-consciously respond to it. So I think now I'm at the point as well. I'm starting to kind of explore that in a practice-based sense as well. I was looking at floor plans quite a bit, and kind of like layouts, and doing some sort of like bits of sort of prints related to that, and looking at embossing and stuff, because I think another thing, it's kind of like, when doing this research, especially as this is the first time I've kind of like done this kind of research residency, it's like, am I interested in something because it's going to affect my work conceptually, or because it's going to affect my work in terms of like process, or both? Really, I'm interested in the sort of like the kind of that space between 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional when it comes to kind of like the walls of a space. So that would include like textured wallpaper, but also include skirting boards, like light switches, the door frames, things like that, things that are kind of like little boxes for phone lines, those sort of things that are essentially kind of like reliefs, right? They kind of like, and it's really, and in posh houses like the cornicing,
cornices,
on ceilings. In terms of then engaging with that from the perspective of a museum collection, you're quite limited. In terms of like the Jeffrey Museum's kind of previous identity is mainly kind of focusing on, first as like a furniture making museum, then focusing quite heavily on sort of like interior design, I suppose. And now the kind of changing sort of nature of the collection in terms of it focusing on the sort of lived experience of the home. These kind of like very much ignored elements don't really feature that much. So I think for me, as part of that process, it was discovering, oh, that's a very interesting kind of like sort of process based sort of like point, because that kind of leads us to sort of like, it leads us to reliefs. Like embossing is very, very interesting, but also kind of like relief collages and things like that, and all of that then folds into the accumulation of domestic space, which I talked about a lot, and the idea of stuff. Like spent a lot of time kind of looking at different categories of stuff as to how that's arranged. So I can't remember what the actual term I used, but one was essentially like meaningful stuff, where the accumulation of different objects, the unself-conscious accumulation of different objects kind of creates meaning through kind of like minor or trivial objects. That's like the shelves in lots of people's like rooms. And then the kind of the chaotic stuff, where it's the accumulation creates like a lack of meaning, essentially, or obscures meaning. And then the strategic, which is the kind of like the self-conscious accumulation and organization of stuff in order to convey, it has an outsideness because it's conveying meaning to someone outside the house and stuff like that. All really, really interesting. But I kind of had to, and that's something for the future, but I had to kind of abandon that because I'm so interested in I didn't really relate to the body in the same way. And also hard to research from like a practical perspective. So again, that's something that might lend itself more towards kind of like form and process when I'm actually kind of like creating, and those observations are interesting. But in terms of like properly engaging with the material that the museum has, and also when I talk about properly engaging, I don't just mean the material, I mean engaging with the museum as an institution and engaging with the people at the museum who are actually helping me research as well. It's got to the point where I kind of have accumulated enough material to start experimenting practically a little bit.
You mentioned the people at the museum. In relation to the people that you've been kind of in contact with and working with, I just wondered, if you could say a little bit more about, who you've been speaking to.
During the sort of the first time I went, that kind of induction, curator Daniel Patton gave me a tour of the galleries, and gave me the kind of curatorial overview, I suppose, of this sort of like decisions that the team had made in terms of the new galleries, and also in terms of all the work that they're intending to do with the older rooms, and the work that they've done with the rooms as well, which is like really interesting. Like there's one, the kind of the West Indies front room, which used to be the 1960s room, is now a 1970s kind of working class Caribbean family, essentially. It's amazing. It's so good. It's the only working class room there. It's interesting, the kind of intersection between different cultures, because like even though that was a room of a family from a completely different cultural background to my own, it's instantly way more recognizable to me in terms of my class background than any other room. In that, and it's just brilliant. It's the room that kind of lives the most, and everyone at the museum is so proud of that room as well, I can tell. So that's really good. And then Daniel took me to the stores as well. I'm looking at kind of where a lot of the objects are kept, essentially, that are on display. Sinead McCarthy last week had a really good, really in-depth discussion with her about explicitly the kind of like artistic side of what I'm doing and my my sort of creative thoughts, and then talking about the event as well, and also some other outcomes that I'd like to do as well. And then also because I'm working with support worker who's helped me with my research. It's called Janine. She I want to sort of do something kind of sort of similar with Janine, that reflects on, from sort of disabled perspective, reflects on the sort of unique collaboration opportunities you have as a disabled artist who's working with a support worker, and the kind of like how that relationship works and stuff like that. I think that's quite important for other disabled artists to see. But the person who is helping me the most with the research is the collections manager, Amy Folds. She is just incredibly interesting, and obviously knows so much about the collection, and is just a great person to talk to as well. She's doing so much more than just facilitating, you know. Had lots of really in-depth discussions about and she drew some really helpful diagrams about how the acquisition process works. And how they take objects into the museum, and the different processes that they go to before they're kind of catalogued, and then what happens to them like kind of after they're catalogued, and then what about if something needs to exit the catalogue, and all of this kind of thing. I didn't realize that getting rid of objects is a minefield. So difficult for museums to get rid of objects, and so there's so much interesting stuff. And so, as I said before, she initially got out a lot of material when I first went down on the first week I was in, which was very useful, very very interesting. Gave me an overview in terms of the sort of start of my research process. And then we started looking more at disability. She, you know, we were kind of suggesting terms, and she was searching in the catalogue. And we kind of we continued that, because we're using a lot of the Documenting Homes stuff as well, which is kind of quite easy to sort of like retrieve. And then we'd sort of suggest a few objects. I'd suggest a few objects for Amy to sort of bring up to the research room before I sort of come in in the morning and stuff like that. This week I started using the catalogue myself, so the kind of very ancient software, yeah, basically searching through that myself, which is a totally different experience.
Yeah,
really, really interesting. And like, it's really, really good that I waited to my 4th week to do that, because I needed an understanding of how the collection was structured before that would make sense. Because I've also looked at a lot of documents about like the provenance of objects and stuff, and how they came into the collection, and the sort of conservation process, and all of the kind of internal documents, which have been super, super useful. Having that institutional understanding has helped me understand all the notes and everything on the system, understand the kind of the process of the sort of the person cataloging the material, and how they may like kind of list stuff. So yeah, that has been very, very interesting. So yesterday I was searching specifically for items of furniture and appliances that had signs of wear on them, looking for signs of like human interaction, and looking for sites of the body, really. And so that was kind of like going through, searching by condition, different words I thought that might have been used. So there was like worn, marked, stained, looking for different things, and then kind of like, and then I was able to give that list to Amy. She was able to sort of say, oh yeah, this is worth looking at. Oh, there's hardly any information on this. Oh, we don't actually have this in the collection anymore, and stuff like that. And kind of like, so getting more information, and then going down to the stores to look at the material, but then also being able to kind of look at Documenting Homes stuff related to it, all the kind of the provenance and the internal documents, and so kind of like Amy's at the center of all that, really. And because she knows the collection so well, she's able to sort of like, a lot of the time she's able to give a sort of like instant impression, or sort of like feedback on what I'm kind of researching, and then sort of suggest other things and stuff like that. So like, she's been absolutely at the center of all of the research that I've been doing. And also Laura, she is on she's doing a PhD, and she's on secondment to Museum of the Home for 6 months, working on cataloging these books about health mainly. And she's just been sort of sat across the table from me, ended up talking a lot, and it ended up me, Laura, and Amy talking a lot, and discovering that there's a lot of what Laura is researching I'm very interested in. She's been able to suggest books. She's able to say, "Oh, look, this is really cataloging this is really interesting." There's all this, a lot of stuff that I didn't necessarily realize was relevant. I don't think I would have even known that Museum of the Home had kind of like books from the 1920s about like exercise and healthy living, for example. But then that's super useful for kind of like my research into the body and the domestic. So yeah, like these relationships and collaborations are fantastic. Like really, really enjoying that element of it.
That's really nice to hear, that as well as the kind of trying to think of the right word of describing it, the kind of structured or official kind of conversations and guidance. There's also like almost like sort of research peer support that's happening incidentally through these other relationships, these sort of incidental relationships and conversations that have started with Laura, which is really great.
Yes.
That's it's been really fantastic to hear, and really useful, that really clear example of how the research process leads, how you're guided through the research process to engage with the sort of cataloging collection, and then in turn with the sort of physical sort of object and then the ideas around it. That's really helpful picture to have sort of painted for me.
The really important thing is that the act of research it's not a means to an end. It's absolutely part of this, and it's going to kind of form part of my creative responses to this just as much as the stuff that I'm actually sort of discovering. And also, I kind of feel like, why wasn't I doing this years ago? Okay, like I'm being kind of like paid for. I'm literally being paid to spend time like doing this, but like I could have, anyone can come and research, anyone can just book a slot and say kind of some things that they're vaguely interested in. And I think that the thing that I didn't necessarily understand is that it's a completely different process a lot of the time if you're an artist to if you're like a PhD researcher or something like that. Like I think a lot of people think of research in this dry academic way, right? Of kind of like, you know, often linked to sort of stressful experiences at university or whatever. Like, oh my God, I've got to write an essay, and so I'm gonna have to go to the library and look for these particular books, and then spend ages like poring over them and you know writing down the page numbers and stuff like that. Or searching on journal websites, you know, that's all like really valid and interesting form of research. But like, you could pick a random museum, you know, collection or archive and go there as a researcher for like half a day, like once a month. And it would like provide you with so much material and so many things to be interested in, because it's the physicality, it's the act of doing it. And it's like, it's different to just going to a museum and looking at the collection, because it's that feeling of unearthing is unlike anything else. It's absolutely fascinating. I mean, and the way that things can get linked together. We looked at some, in the original textiles thing, we looked at some curtains, and they were fine. They were just some curtains. And then yesterday, when looking at the catalogue, I ended up looking at a documenting homes collection. That was someone talking about their experience of their grandparents' house and how, and some of the furniture in there that the museum had acquired, and some of it was the curtains, and it turned out it was the curtains that we'd already looked at. So then we took them out again, properly unfolded them, and the experience of that physical object was entirely different, you know? And that in itself is research. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. That's very much so. Yeah. Oh, well, listen, thank you so much for sort of talking to us today. That's been really, massively insightful.